this is what Nancy Pelosi did in her speech at the Oxford Union. She used the word ethnonationalist 5 times. It's the same thing. It's just another way of saying, accusing half of America of being racist. She even used the word, she made up a word, quite a fantastic word actually. It's ethnic negativity, which just means racist.
Let's bid a warm welcome to Winston Marshall, who joins us, former member of Mumford Sons. He's a musician, he's a podcaster, and a man with many opinions, I think it's safe to say. A warm welcome to Times Radio. Thanks for being with us.
Kate, thank you for having me on your show.
I'm really interested to start talking to you about some of your assessment of politics at the moment, focusing on democracy. And this was something that you talked about in your Oxford Union speech recently. It was a debate with the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi about whether populism is a threat to democracy. And I wonder, for starters, whether there is a problem, you think, with democracy and the notion of democracy in politics.
That's a good question. So the debate was, as you say, is populism a threat to democracy? Former Speaker of the House, Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, took the motion, and I argued against that. It wasn't populism that was a threat to democracy. It was elites like her that were a threat to democracy. And I tried to make the case. The problems we've seen, particularly in America with democracy, is an undermining by institutions, by the mainstream media, by intelligence services, for example, by social media. This was particularly made clear with the Twitter files, that there was a across-the-board attempts to undermine some of the key things we need for democracy. I'll give you an example.
We should just point out that the Twitter files are the files released by Elon Musk when he bought Twitter, took over Twitter X, as it now is, and they exposed some of the content which had been held back.
Exactly. What they exposed, amongst other things, was intelligence services contacting people at Twitter, and we know that this happened to other social media companies, specifically requesting or recommending that certain voices were silenced, certain voices were shadow banned, and I can't remember the exact term they used, but shadow ban is what people are more familiar with, the concept. So this is in my opinion, against the First Amendment. And actually, this is something that's been going on in the States. It's in the Supreme Court. It's Biden versus Missouri. Actually, I believe now it's called Biden versus Murphy, which is we're due the decision from the Supreme Court next month, so we'll find out. And actually, I have spoken to people involved in the case, and it looks like Biden will win on a technicality, which is just, this is a bit of a side from our greater conversation, but the technicality is that the government didn't command big tech to censor any particular voices. They simply suggested it. So the First Amendment says they mustn't coerce. So they wasn't coercion. But my response to that, my opinion to that is, if I got a letter through the door here in London from the government saying, don't do this, I would see that as threatening. Or I would think, what if I do to it? What's going to happen to me? So it's implicit, if not necessarily explicit. But that's a side point. So I see that the greater threats to democracy at the moment in America has been from these institutions undermining free speech. Another example of this would be the Hunter Biden laptop story, which was released by the New York Post a month before the American presidential elections in 2020. Firstly, no other mainstream media reported on it. Now, after the elections, 2 years after the elections, the New York Times said, actually, it was real. These are serious things. There was a poll done saying it wouldn't necessarily have changed the result of the election, but it might have changed the result. It could have. And if you remember that election, there wasn't actually that many votes technically between Trump and Biden. Yeah. It was something like 50,000 votes that made the difference. So
look, I'm going to summarise for time. You have serious concerns about institutions, not just in America, but I also presume here as well, that might clamp down on free speech, on someone's right to be able to express an opinion. I'm broad-stroking that massively. But what I'd like to know is whether the potential second term for Donald Trump in the United States is then a welcome thought for you. Does this mean that we're kicking back against some of the frustration or the restriction of free speech by, voters being drawn to Donald Trump and what he stands for, which upsets a lot of Democrats, obviously upsets a lot of the more liberal people in the United States, but he is hitting a sweet spot there at the moment.
I personally resent the Democrats that they have done all of these things that make Trump bigger, and that you end up in a position where they're actually turning Trump into a victim. An example of this would be how they've taken him off the ballot, or tried to take him off the ballot in both Maine and Colorado in the states, quite literally attempting to undermine democracy. I resent that it has to be Trump that fills that vacuum, that they do that. Now, if you want to discuss...
So does that mean that by default it's Donald Trump? It's not that you support Donald Trump or what he's about, it's just that he is the victim of the Democrats messing things up?
The conversation about Trump is a tricky one, and it's a long conversation. I'm very happy to have that.
You didn't support him in 2016, did you?
No.
Okay.
So in 2016, I would have been quite anti-Trump.
Yeah.
I was living in New York at the time. I was surrounded by liberal elite types, precisely the people I was railing about in my Oxford Union speech. And when Trump won, my reaction was, oh my goodness, how did I not see this coming? How out of touch am I with half of America? When I'd lived in America for a long time, at that point, I think I'd visited something like 40 states. At this point, I've visited 48 states. It's a country I know very well. I lived both in the South, I lived on the coasts, and I toured it extensively. I felt, oh wow, I'm out of touch. How is it that half the country voted for this people? What do I not understand? Now, my peers had a very different reaction. They were like, oh, well, America must be racist. The only possible reason that you could vote for Trump is that you are a racist. And by the way, this is what Nancy Pelosi did in her speech at the Oxford Union. She used the word ethnonationalist 5 times. It's the same thing. It's just another way of saying, accusing half of America of being racist. She even used the word, she made up a word, quite a fantastic word actually. It's ethnic negativity, which just means racist. My reaction, so in 2016, was, what do I not understand? So I went on the journey to try and understand what it was that was appealing about Trump to so many people. And another thing that's worth picking up as well is that, because that was the time of Bernie as well, who the DNC had
Bernie Sanders, who represented the
populist left.
The left,
But very much the populist left. It was Bernie against the billionaires. Now, 1/4 of Bernie supporters did not vote for Hillary. 1/2 of that quarter voted for Trump. So you have the populist left who were attracted to the populist right because
so you've got this crossover.
Because I think they identified some of the same problems, the same issues.
With feeling marginalised, wanting a voice,
problems with globalization. Now, globalization is a really important part of the populist movement, right and left. And a good example of this is the 1999 Battle for Seattle movements. I think this is one of the first populist in the modern populist era. It's one of the first big key moments. 1999, there were protests against the WTO. And if you look at the left-wing populist movement, apart from being against the billionaires, Bernie, one of the other appeals was against globalizations. Now, we can talk about the nuances of globalizations. There's negatives and positives. It's very easy to talk about the positives, and it's very easy to write off the negative sides. But just like immigration would be a similar issue, what are the negative sides of it? Well, there's driving down of wages. There's, with immigration, which is one aspect of globalization, there is increasing crime. There's social disunity. There are many problems. Now, I'm not even necessarily against immigration. In fact, I've done a lot of work to help Hong Kongers assimilate into the UK. There are positives and negatives both, and we must be able to talk about the negatives.
Yes, okay, fair enough. Look, I want to come back to UK politics, if that's okay, because you've talked about what you think about US politics. We've got an election in 6 weeks' time.
I've learned. What
do you think?
Well, firstly, Rishi was completely humiliated and drenched yesterday, and for good reason. For good reason. It's maybe distasteful of me to say that, but I sort of took some joy in seeing it, because I think he has completely, like Nancy Pelosi in America and the elites there, disregarded working people in Britain. I think that if you remember why the Tories were elected in 2019, the mandate they were given was, one was to deliver Brexit, and the other was levelling up. And if you look at what how they spun after, or which direction they went after Liz Truss, and then again with Rishi, they've completely abandoned the issues that had them elected in the first place.
From 2019.
From 2019. And on so in that sense, they've been, Rishi's been a disaster.
Is democracy an issue here in this country as well? In the UK, is the fight for democracy real? Do we struggle?
Well, some of the things I talked about earlier in this conversation about government dealing with free speech, rather betraying free speech principles, we saw that with the Conservative government. A famous example would be Matt Hancock when he was Health Secretary at the beginning of the pandemic. He himself was also in cahoots, cahoots is the wrong word. He was in discussion with big tech to try and deal with dissenting voices. So the Conservatives have not been defenders of free speech in their reign at all.
Okay. What is the answer? So when we look at what we've got politically in this country now, where are you most drawn to? For someone like you who's worried about democracy, who's worried about free speech and the fact that it's being hampered, in your opinion, who are you most attracted to out of the political parties? Who are you going to vote for?
I am not particularly attracted to any of them. I note that almost all of them, their campaign seems to be, we're not the others. I'm not really sure if any of the parties are for anything. Now, almost certainly I'll be voting for the Social Democrat Party, who are for something. They are centre-left economically, centre-right socially. I think that they are much more, they're pretty close to the mandate that the Tories got elected on in 2019. It's a lot of people won't know who the Social Democrats are.
Well, traditionally maybe, but the SDP now are, something of a once again kind of fledgling party, aren't they? In terms of the fact that they don't have any MPs, they don't have much in terms of campaign funds, but they are going to be standing. Not in every single constituency,
not in every
certainly.
And now that it's only a few weeks away, it's going to be very difficult.
They are going to have select candidates, but we actually had Baroness Claire Fox on the show yesterday talking about them, actually talking up them and what they stand for, which is that immigration can be a good thing, but they don't believe in open borders. There are various things to which they're aligned with the Conservative Party, it has to be said, but there are also other ways in which they are different. However, the SDP are not going to be forming a government in this country, and they're nowhere near if you compare them to Reform or to the Liberal Democrats. They've still got a long way to go. What do you make of Nigel Farage not running?
I was a little bit disappointed with the letter he put out, or that he said that he was concentrating on the American elections. This is a man who purports to be the leader of the populist right in the UK, and yet it seemed from first glance of the letter that he's prioritizing politics in America. I don't know why. I don't know exactly what's going on.
I think he's given up on UK politics.
What do you think?
I don't know. I wonder if you think Farage has just gone, I can no longer do anything with this. He has since said this afternoon that he's going to be helping out where I can. That's what he said. But it is an interesting pivot to have so long been courted by Reform, to be their honorary president, to be helping them out where he can, but essentially to be committing his serious time over the next few months and certainly beyond the next 6 weeks to Donald Trump.
There are some constituencies in the UK which, if he did run, he would walk. He would have no problem getting a seat in Parliament.
Why is he not doing it then?
You'd have to interview him.
Look, tell me about you and why you're into this, why you're into, looking at democracy, worried about democracy, advocating for populism. Why are you so interested? You come from a family with a lot of influence. Your dad is Paul Marshall, donor to the Lib Dems, then fell out with them, then Vote Leave, an investor in GB News. What are your political ambitions? Where are you going with this?
At the moment, I don't have political ambitions, but I'll tell you on a very basic level why I care. I love my country. I love this country. I'm patriotic. I'm a Christian. I'm commanded to love my neighbour. And how can anyone look around and see the state of the place? We have a new, it seems like a new sort of techno-serfdom where you have one group of people who are very well off, and then you have a lot of people who are. We have this housing crisis that's just.
But you're part of the people who are well off, or your family is anyway. So how do you bridge that gap? Why do we listen to you?
You don't have to listen to me. I'm not telling anyone to listen to me. It's up to them who they listen to. You're right that I'm from a very lucky background, and actually, if anything, my greatest privilege is that I have two very loving parents and very supportive parents, and a loving girlfriend, and those are my great blessings, and I'm great. Praise the Lord for them every day. But it doesn't matter what background you're from to not care about injustice. It doesn't matter what background you're from to not care about people who are struggling. How can we're all human? How can you see suffering? How can you see poverty and not care about it?
Mm. Do you want to occupy this space more? The fact that you are, talking out against mainstream politics, you are suggesting that there might be another way, another solution, that the order of things is not correct at the moment, that we're not living in a democracy, that politics is not helping us, it is hindering us. Is there a space for you, do you think? I mean, you've been interviewed by Piers Morgan and Sebastian Gorka, plenty of big names here, and your voice is being amplified. So is the desire perhaps to amplify that voice more? Do you see yourself, advocating within your space like Jordan Peterson does within his, for example? I'm trying to work it out.
Advocating, the only thing I'm advocating is the truth as I see it. I sort of have an allegiance to the SDP party, who are closest to my personal politics, which is why I support them. And in some sense, I supported Amy Gallagher in her London mayoral run. So in that sense, I'm advocating. I care about lies. It's frustrating to hear people lie. I think one observation about the Nancy Pelosi Oxford Union debate is that I think, firstly, they couldn't get anyone else to defend populism. And I think probably because of my career or whatever position I'm in, there's a lot of people who feel what I said, and you can tell that by the response and how popular my speech was online, but who wouldn't have the fortune of getting into the room. So if I've got the fortune, I should say what I think, and clearly what I think has resonated with a lot of people.
Let's talk about Mumford Sons. In 2021, you were a member of the band. You tweeted in support of a book by the Vietnamese-American journalist Andy Ngo called Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. It digs into the history of Antifa's extreme approach and their roots in the radical left. You tweeted in support of that. What happened?
I think this was lockdown 2 or about that time. So those couple of years, I think everyone will remember, there was a lot of hysteria. I, throughout the lockdown, was tweeting to my not many followers. I mean, I think I had about 3,000 followers on Twitter. The books I was reading, which included everything from War and Peace to Mao's Little Red Book, very controversial book, Mao's Little Red Book, but apparently not in this day and age. And I see it a little bit like an act of God, but this tweet blew up. It went up all the trending charts. It ended up being a segment on The View and Tucker Carlson in the States. I couldn't quite believe it, and it could have just come and gone, I guess, but off Twitter, in my real life, everything imploded.
You were being heavily criticised for your support of this book, we should say.
It wasn't just criticism, because criticism is fine. There were professional threats. Radio stations in the States said they wouldn't play the band. In this country, I was dropped from a festival from DJing. And there were also many death threats and threats to the families of my bandmates and people I was working with. So it wasn't just criticism. It went beyond that. I criticize people a lot, and I think criticism is very important. And I welcome criticism, even of my ideas, of course. That's what free speech is. That's the beauty of it. But I don't... and I was prepared on a personal level to take the flack, but I wasn't fair on the people I was working with, i.e. my band, to also take that flack. Long story short, and it is a long one, and I have talked about it a lot on other interviews, I eventually felt that the only way forward was for me to leave the band, and yeah, so that's what happened.
Do you regret that decision now?
I don't really think about.
I mean, it's a funny word, isn't it? Regret's an awful word to use, actually. There must be days when you miss it. Incredibly.
There's a connection you have when you're locked into a song or a piece of music, and especially if it's performed live, you're with a band, and you can reach the transcendent, and there's a magic there that I absolutely miss and loved. I love the studio as well, and I still go into the studio and make music. I've actually sitting on some songs which I'm hoping I'm going to put out. I've kind of given up on my commercial ambitions. For me, it's just artistic at this point, partly because of the dogpile from the industry, and it is a gatekeeper's industry. So in certain circles, music industry circles, it's been made clear to me I'm persona non grata. So, but that's fine.
Is this when you've tried to go back into the music industry, or you've thought about launching a solo career, that people have said no?
Yes. But it's not everyone, and there's a lot of people in the music industry, funnily enough, who will privately DM me, well, they did at the time, and said, and big pop stars say, I read that book, what's the problem? And so, but
a lot of people said that. I mean, people got upset by the book. There were all sorts of accusations thrown out by the LA Times, etc. But a lot of people have said that is just a book of, history, effectively. It is one journalist who himself was attacked by Antifa in his reporting and journalism of them. So there's kind of split opinion about the book. But I think now we look back on it, because I do think that was a very sensitive time. Lockdown 2, I think a lot of things were magnified.
Yeah.
And probably a lot of us might look back at that period and say, well, maybe I did blow that out of proportion a bit. Maybe we were all about cancelling people. We were angry about George Floyd still. We were angry about being cooped up still.
Well, I'll just colour in for the book.
Yeah, go on.
So the author actually this week was Andy No, just appeared on Dr. Phil. So he has become mainstream.
Yeah.
But
yet he wasn't back at that time.
He wasn't at that time. And I'll just colour it in further. So the topic of the book was specifically covering the behaviour of radical progressives, the Antifa movement, this is all in the States, and the riots around the BLM after the killing of George Floyd. Now, 19 people were killed in the first 14 days of those riots.
Yeah.
Many, many businesses, not least black businesses, were destroyed in those riots. And I get at this in Nancy Pelosi in my speech with her, the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon, was under siege for the entire month of June and well into July, over 50 straight days.
There were mass protests there. It was the focal point.
Mass protests.
Wasn't it?
They were trying to burn the building down whilst there were officers inside. It was. You can see this footage still. It's on YouTube if you want to look into it. But now, here's the important context. If you remember, at that time, BLM was not to be criticised. You could not say anything against BLM. Now, there's lots of positive energy behind BLM fighting injustice, and it's worth acknowledging that. But the organisation itself was a Marxist organisation, i.e. far left. They were explicitly anti-capitalist. They were explicitly anti-family. All of this, I'd read all the literature, Patrice Kahn-Cullors. I was familiar with what the organisation was about. Now, actually, the book, Andy No's book, doesn't deal with the organisation. It dealt with what happened. And I hope you would agree that people dying in protests is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And the problem I had, though, by praising this book or recommending the book was that it was then seen as a criticism of the BLM movement. Antifa, and this is a very clever play on words, if you question Antifa, well, quick semantics, it's like, oh, if you're anti-FAR, doesn't that mean... If you're anti-Antifa, doesn't that mean you're pro-FAR? So it's a word game play there. So
pro-fascism.
Well, that's how it would be easily spun. But if you actually look into the behaviour, the violent behaviour of these anarchist far-left mobs, albeit a small group of splinter cells, but they did a hell of a lot of damage.
Okay. Can I ask you about Mumford and Sons again and ask you why they let you leave so easily?
You'd have to ask them.
disappointing?
It's been a difficult. It was probably the hardest experience of my life. Yeah.
Where are you going now with your free speech warrior persona? With your concern about politics, democracy, where are you going now with this?
Well, free speech. There's something worth picking up on here because in America, this month there was a bill passed led by the Republicans called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. Now, this and amongst other things we've seen in America is a lot of people who have purported to be pro-free speech. Their principles on free speech seem to be not so principled. And so the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, amongst other things, brings in a definition of anti-Semitism that means that it's not just inciting violence, it's even seemingly any criticism of Israel, any challenging of the Holocaust as if you to deny the Holocaust, that would be made illegal by in education by the Department of Education. Now, don't get me wrong, my grandma's a Holocaust survivor. I'm a Zionist. I'm against those things, but we must let people speak. Now, so I'm just making an observation that in recent times we're seeing the principles of conservatives and right-wingers on free speech come into question. So that's what I see going. I'm not sure if you're asking me on a personal level or what I see. I don't know about on a personal level, but I have got a show called The Winston Marshall Show. It's on YouTube. I've just done an interview with Mazia Linejad, who is the Iranian exile who left Iran. She wrote a beautiful book called Wind in My Hair. And of course, everything we're seeing in Iran, the proxy war, which has now turned into a direct war with Israel. We got into all of that. We just saw, of course, the president was just killed, although that doesn't seem, as far as I've looked into it, to be suspicious. But it's, but anyway, I'm not equipped to comment on that thing. So, interviewed Mazzy about what she's experienced. She, in turn, has experienced a lot of progressives coming after her in the States for her criticisms of Islam, of the Islamic regime in Iran. So there are free speech issues there as well. So that's one interview we've just done and I'm excited about. So yeah, I have this interview show. I love it. I love exploring ideas. And I think that more speech is the answer and more diversity of opinion, more ideas. And that's where I'm sort of focused at the moment.
It's been a real pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for sharing some of your ideas with us on Times Radio. Winston Marshall, thank you.
Kate, thanks for having me on the show.